Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast for 26th January 2023. My name's Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Mark, it's Peter Ryan here, and usually, as you know, I'm based in Montreal, but this week I'm in Tbilisi, Georgia, where I am visiting this beautiful city and country for meetings with different CX and BPO stakeholders in the private sector and the government.
Okay, well, it's probably warmer over there than back in Canada right now, I guess.
That wouldn't be hard, trust me, but it is fresh, it's beautiful, and I am really taken aback by the extent to which the enthusiasm for customer experience management, customer experience operations from overseas and servicing consumers around the world has really taken hold here. And it's really telling that I'm coming to you today from a different offshore location because we had the privilege for this week's interview of chatting with Paige Webster. Now, Paige is the owner and the principal consultant at his own firm, which is Webster Global Site Selectors. And we went through a whole series of topics in our very lively chat, some of which ranged from the extent to which remote working has shifted the role of the site selector, what a site selector actually does, what the perceptions might be, but what they actually do. And we even got into the topic about how shopping centers, dead malls, as we've been seeing on lots of YouTube videos, could be rejuvenated with the implementation of new BPO facilities.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there's always this question of, what is the public transport like? Do you have a great location, but people can't actually get there? There's so many variables involved in this. And I think that one of the interesting ones post-pandemic is just this question of how you're blending work from home with new sites that companies are opening. I mean, did you go into that in the conversation then?
Yeah, absolutely. We did talk a little bit about that. Paige has got a tremendous amount of experience about looking at what the emerging models are going to be in terms of how BPOs are going to approach what they're going to do with regards to staffing. And labor market's a big issue, but as he said, nowadays, it's not just about the labor market, but it's about the infrastructure. Can the infrastructure from a transport and network connectivity perspective manage to sustain not just facilities, but also people working remotely? And it doesn't necessarily have to be in their homes. It could be in other remote co-working spaces, coffee shops, etc. I think something else that Paige brought to the table that was really interesting was the role of what a site selector does in regards to working with the economic development offices. Now, he comes from an economic development background himself, and something that he brought to the table in the course of our discussion was the fact that you get some really good EDOs, you get some really good investment promotion agencies. You also get ones that aren't necessarily as easy to deal with, but your role as a site selector working with a client is to make sure that entry into a particular location is going to be as seamless as possible. And the background that Paige brings to the table with his role as a former economic development officer and now working with private sector clients, I think gives a very well-rounded view about what this balance of this ecosystem really has when you bring to the table.
Okay, that's great. Well, why don't we go straight to the interview with Paige Webster on site selection and how it works.
Sounds good. The topic of site selection is always important when it comes to the customer experience sector, as well as companies that play in the outsourcing space, which is why today we're so excited to be chatting on the CX Files with Paige Webster. Now, for those who don't know Paige, he's the owner of Webster Global Site Selectors. He's headquartered in Phoenix, but has offices in Denver. But as we were chatting before I hit the record button, we're both very much digital nomads, road warriors, global travelers, and it seems that our favorite film collectively is Up in the Air with George Clooney. Paige, great to have you on the CX Files. Thanks for taking some time.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I really appreciate it. I think this is a good opportunity to talk about site selection and the BPO industry sector as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's timely that we're having this chat, Paige, because we can all agree that a lot of things changed between March of 2020 all the way through to really, I think, the end of 2022. And one of the topics that doesn't get enough discussion, in my opinion, is that about site selection. So maybe a good starting point for our confab today would be to start out by talking a little bit about what you see as the key differences between what your clients would have been looking for when they were trying to find a new contact center or outsourcing site prior to the pandemic, and what are the priorities now for them?
Yeah, that's a great question, Peter. I think that prior pandemic, a lot of it, of course, was labor, which is still related to today. The availability of labor, the language barriers that may take place, those are still continuing to be continuous through the search process. But where it's really changed is the facilities. And, you used to have facilities that were anywhere between 500 and 3,000 individuals in a facility. With the pandemic, obviously, that has been reduced. And now there are, I guess, what they would call kind of quasi, whether the associate is in the office or actually working from a home-based under a contract on behalf of the BPO.
Okay, interesting. All right, that's
Yeah.
really interesting. So from taking that into consideration, Paige, I'd be curious from the standpoint of your role, and maybe if you could talk to us a little bit about what a site selector actually does, because I think there's a lot of conceptions out there, but there might be some misperceptions too. And as you describe what you do in your position with Webster Global Site Selectors, maybe talk a little bit about what the clients come to you in terms of gaining counsel or gaining advice, and what the expectations the client has from a BPO perspective about why they would work with a site selector.
Yeah, so most industry sectors, whether it's BPO or aerospace or even general manufacturing, I mean, their expertise in the business that they are conducting. A lot of perceptions, I guess, of a site selector is that we're a name that is an elegant real estate broker. Well, real estate is part of site selection, but there are many other aspects to the process. In this industry sector, in the BPO industry sector, again, what we're looking for is cost effectiveness. And ultimately, we're trying to reduce risk and time to market. So we might be analyzing quality and quantity of labor. We'll look at the real estate, but we also have to look at the infrastructure. If you currently have a community that may have a beautiful 40,000 square foot facility, but they don't have the telecommunication to assist in the BPO marketplace, then it's to put that capital investment in to get that infrastructure is a hurdle, but it can also be a way for the community to enhance that they have a viable physical building in their community. The other thing that we've noticed too is that a lot, I would say pre-COVID, maybe even dating back to early 90s, is that a lot of developers were losing retailers in their retail spaces, and they were trying to convert them into BPOs or contact centers. But what we've come across in a lot of situations is that the CC&Rs or the rules of the specific development would not allow for that type of project in those developments. And I think I've seen a change in that. These developers are actually changing their way to accommodate a major employer that could go into a mall or a big box space because the parking's there, which is part of the infrastructure. Some of these malls had created food courts, so then you're able to feed the staff. So I think when they first came out that they wanted to redevelop, these centers. They weren't able to because of the way that the policies were in place. And now they're changing laws and even at the local building of the CCNRs to be able to accommodate. So there is an activity to get that in some of these, I wouldn't say dilapidated, but just kind of properties that have not been able to be successful in the retail sector.
But I want to touch on that for a second, because you've brought something up that fascinates me. I'm a bit of a YouTube geek, and I've got a lot of different channels I look at, and there's a few of them that are effectively urban explorers going through dilapidated or dead shopping centers. Some of them are actually even still operational with like maybe one store open. But a couple of years ago, one of my analysts, Sean Goforth, wrote a blog on the site hypothesizing, could the shopping centers that are falling apart or that have gone into a state of disuse in the USA start housing CX or BPO operations? And I think it's a very viable question, considering when you travel to South Africa, to India, to the Philippines, shopping centers, like active shopping centers, are accommodating very large scale contact center operations and outsourcing operations. In fact, a great one, Paige, that we were talking about the Dominican Republic before we went live recording. There's a great one that's opened up with Glow Touch in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. There's a great example. Do you think this is something that we could start seeing more of in terms of how North American shopping centers, that I think we can all agree in many cases have fallen on very hard times, could start bringing into the mix?
I think so, because you've already got the infrastructure in place. Sometimes that, again, getting to the telecommunication side of it, the malls they don't have, T1 lines, or they don't have the telecommunication trunk that comes to the specific property. But if you really look at it from a standpoint of a redevelopment of an existing mall that may only have one tenant, you have a lot of people in an area that are working. They need to be fed, and they like to consume. So the retailers may end up actually coming back and providing services to, let's say, a dead or an underdeveloped mall. Retailers are always looking for where that shopper is going to be. And so I think it's an aspect that they could possibly really look at that. Even smaller rural communities, if they've got the telecommunication infrastructure, to redevelop that. And typically when you have a mass amount of population that's making income, the retailers are going to follow it. And there's a misconception that there's a misconception that we need to attract more retailers, but typically they're lower wages. And if you're getting a higher waged job, such as a BPO, then they can actually, the economy is growing that way, in a sense that then they can go and use their dollars for consumer products. So I mean, I think it's a good way to revive. The other thing that I've noticed too is a lot of the large big box facilities across mainly the United States. I don't know if it is in Canada as well, Peter, but they sometimes will go ahead and pay the lease so that their competitors don't come in. But this is actually a natural curve, that a BPO is not a competitor of a Cabela's versus a Bass Pro Shop. It's not even in that industry sector. So why not open those doors instead of paying that lease and letting that building collapse to hold their competitors from going in there?
So part of the role of a site selector is really to work also with local economic development authorities, with investment promotion agencies. Can you speak a little bit about what that's like when you're working with a BPO and going effectively representing them as they're figuring out what their approach is going to be and working with the different jurisdictional bodies?
Yeah, so typically government entities or nonprofit entities, it's typically their incentives, which is part of our process as well, is to negotiate incentives. A majority of the United States and a lot of other countries, they parlay that their incentive package will be related around job creation. So the BPO industry sector is creating a lot of jobs, correct? Because it's a large job creation industry sector. So our role is to introduce them to these government officials, but also when the timing is right and the client has determined a location, and you always want to negotiate the incentives to help assist those overall costs to the BPO, which then in turn, what do we go back to? It reduces risk and time to market for a client that's looking to expand. But we have interactions with government agencies all the time. I just got, before our podcast here, Peter, state of Virginia called me. They're coming out and they want to tell me about their new programs that are being in place because there's a new governor in Virginia at the end of February. They're always trying to change ways to assist companies throughout the United States and other countries. And as a site selector, we have to be aware of what those programs are.
So thinking about the role that you would take helping an organization potentially find a spot in the United States or in somewhere in the nearshore and the offshore, Paige, what would the different criteria look like? How would an American site selection look different versus, say, somewhere in Mexico or the Dominican Republic or the Philippines or South Africa? How would those choices, how would those different factors upon the decision-making process weigh one next to the other?
Well, and in site selection, and typically in this industry sector, the experts probably already know this, but in other sectors, they will look at let's say a manufacturer that has to distribute their product in the Southeast. They're going to look in those Southeast states, right? In this industry sector, which is very interesting, it's more looking at time zones. So really, you could be competing in Alberta, but it goes all the way down through Mexico. That time zone goes north and south instead of however the state however the border is within the state or within the country. And I'm sure that happens also with looking at, let's say, Japan. You're gonna look in that time zone because that's when your employees are servicing the customer. It follows time zones, and I would say a lot of economic developers or government agencies, they only want to say, hey, it's our state of North Dakota, and that's where we really need to look. But in this industry sector, they have to look at who they're competing with within the central time zone in North Dakota. And that goes clear up into Alberta and as far south as Mexico City. And then what you do is you parlay it from a standpoint that where are those wages more effective? Yeah, you might be able to get a better incentive package in North Dakota because they're trying to create jobs, but compare that to an annual wage versus down in Mexico, those wages are going to be substantially lower. And then we go up into Canada, your wages are adequate or equivalent to what's in the US. So that might put you further down on the list here in the United States and in Canada. I would say overall, as a site selector, we are psychologists as well. We're prepped to be able to provide clients the in-depth knowledge that we have, because again, they're in the process of getting contracts and engaging with associates that will be working with them. And what I really find in site selection is that they can be experts in their manufacturing, but they're not experts in really figuring out where an expansion or a relocation is going to take place.
Makes a lot of sense. So let's finish off our chat here, Paige,
Sure.
with something that you alluded to at the outset of our discussion, and that is the influence that remote working, that's really taken on a life of its own over the course of the past few years, has had on site selection decisions. How would you enunciate remote working or work from home and the impact that it's had, say, on what you do or what your colleagues in the industry around site selection do?
Yeah, one thing that we're really saying is that to try to get those specific public incentives, it's very difficult if those individuals are not housed in one location. So I would suggest to economic development organizations throughout the world is that they really need to start changing their philosophy on how the job is created and where it's located, whether it's a hybrid location or whether it's, because I don't think that the worker is going to maintain going back and working a 9-to-5 job in a location. I have a source in an engineering firm that it's all office space. Okay, so it's not this sector. But they've reduced their square footage from 100 square feet per individual in an office to 50, because they've gone to the hybrid philosophy. And so now that corporate real estate executive for that corporation is looking at smaller spaces and shared spaces versus having a 10,000 square foot facility. So they're actually taking it in half, which doesn't really help the office market. But when we're also looking at office markets, sometimes in this industry sector, they might get a better lease rate because there's a saturation of office space that's available. So you might actually get a better lease rate now than when the activity was together and everybody was together. So I think that to throw that crystal ball out there, I don't think there's a real true answer, because I think that what's going to drive it is either the real estate and really the philosophical aspect of how the employee wants to either be in an office or not. I mean, you and I are working remotely right now. And I don't think we would want to be in an office setting, but some operations have to require that.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. Well, Paige Webster, it has been absolutely phenomenal catching up with you. And I think that what you brought to the table today are some really interesting lessons, not just in terms of site selection, but also considerations that outsourcers need to be putting on the table when they're determining what their next spot's going to be. If they're going to locate a center, what size of the center, what some of the options might be that they might not have thought of. So thanks very much for illuminating us today.
Sure, no problem, Peter. Thanks for the opportunity and the time, and hope to see you somewhere on an airplane.
Yeah, that's a guaranteed.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome.